Hey everybody, this is the second part of a two-parter about the red pill. If you haven't seen the first vid, I would highly recommend watching that one first. I mean, you do you, but if it were me, I'd watch that one first. Rather than providing a recap of the last video or reintroducing the film, I just want to jump straight into it. Ideas that I talked about in part 1 will resurface as they become useful. Around the 40-minute mark, the red pill has a tone shift. The introduction to the film is mostly concerned with the unfair treatment of men in labor. But after this point, the film wants to make another big argument, that men are routinely oppressed when it comes to domestic and reproductive stuff. One of the points the film makes here is a good one. Even as there seems to be a movement in a more egalitarian direction, the family court system is still biased against men and continues to see mothers as the de facto better parent.
After 14 years, my body gave out. I got sicker than I've ever been. I realized I'm going to die. That's not going to do anybody good. I've got to give up the fight. So I gave up custody. And so I don't see my son anymore. He hasn't been in my house since.
Interestingly enough, though, the film doesn't really center on this issue. After a survey of the family court problem, the movie begins to focus on a more general claim. That once a man impregnates a woman, or is told that he impregnated a woman, he loses all power. The power to abort, the power to keep the kid rather than put it up for adoption, the power to know if the kid is his, and yes, the power to have custody. This whole section of the movie is kinda strange. Like, in part 1, I talked about how the film structured its first set of arguments. First, it presented a legitimate problem. Second, it used that problem to further the narrative that men have it worse than women do. And third, it presented that point in such a way as to make it seem like the left and feminism couldn't care less about the issues men face. And that structure, on the face of it, was a problem. It was unnecessarily reductive and was divisive, and I don't think it led to very productive conclusions. But there was something concrete there, right? A sense that there was a clear angle to the argument. Compared to the first section of the film, this part about paternal disempowerment feels a lot less pointed, a lot more complicated, and ultimately, a whole lot weirder. Around this time, the movie stops really caring about systematic issues or oppressions. Instead, it starts to use anecdotes and sentimentality to evoke the feeling that some great injustice has been done, regardless of whether one has or hasn't. Let's look at some examples. First, we have a story from Harry Crouch about a woman who knowingly had 5 kids with a man who wasn't her husband. He tells this story with a lot of gravity, like, see how big a problem paternity fraud is? It ruined this family.
Like a situation in Texas, where the family had 5 little towhead kids, all guys, all little blondos. And all of a sudden, one day, one of the little blondo kids gets in trouble, has to go to the hospital. They can't get a hold of mom, they get a hold of dad. Dad rushes to the hospital, needs to give blood. Whoops. Can't do it. Wrong blood. What? All the kids look alike. Turns out it was the guy down the street.
You've heard of this case?
No, it's a real case. How do you think it feels? I mean, it's horrific. Horrific. That's not wrongful, that's deliberate.
So that's paternity fraud.
That's paternity fraud.
She knew who the father was.
And, paternity fraud is a really complicated topic. In the 90s, before DNA testing became widely available, if you were recognized as the child's father, there wasn't much you could do to get out of your parental obligation. But since then, things have been rapidly changing. Every state I've looked at has made it possible for a man to contest paternity, even if he indicated that he was the father at some point. Even Nebraska and Florida, 2 states that dragged their feet on paternity testing, both reversed their decisions and allowed DNA to decide fatherhood in courts. Now, it is true that if you raise the non-bio kid as your own for a time, many courts will be less likely to sever your child support burden. You'll probably need proof of fraud, and you'll definitely need proof that you immediately cut off ties to the kid when you realized it wasn't yours. But this stuff is a strange balancing act for everybody involved. Fathers have to balance their concern and affection for the kid against the weight of their financial burden. And courts have to negotiate between father's rights and the best interests of the child. It's a nuanced system, and to look at it and say definitively that men are put under attack by it seems a bit misleading. That said, Harry Crouch isn't really talking about any of this stuff, is he? The story he tells doesn't refer back to problems with paternity fraud legislation or to problems with government in general. It's just a story about a mean adulterer and her sad husband. There's really nothing we can say about the incident besides, sorry the bad thing happened. Wish your wife hadn't done that.
Can you fathom what happens to this family? How do you think the kids feel when they find out dear old dad isn't dear old dad and is the guy down the street? How do you think dad feels?
Or look here, where Jay shows us an article about a guy in South Carolina whose kid was adopted out without his consent.
I started to research some fathers' rights issues and came across some harrowing stories. Like this man in South Carolina who found out his only daughter was adopted away by the mother without his knowledge or consent.
His daughter was with an adoptive family in California, so he began his fight to get his daughter back.
I looked into the article and it's pretty nuts. Apparently there's still a law on South Carolina's books from back when miscegenation was illegal. It says that if a child is mixed race, you're allowed to put them up for adoption outside of state lines and without the father's consent. And the girlfriend's mom used this racist loophole to do just that. Yeesh. There's two things I'd like to point out about this story. First, it's obviously not representative of America's general disposition toward adoption. Like, random, archaic miscegenation laws are not usually exploited to prevent a father from keeping his kid. That's called a freak accident, right? Second, the guy got his kid back. Yeah, the movie doesn't mention it, but the father went to court and was able to reclaim his daughter. These two facts make it impossible for us to look at this story and see a broad societal problem. It's just a weird, awful story about a guy temporarily getting screwed over. Nothing more, nothing less. In every state, a father can prevent his child's adoption if he demonstrates that he wants to help raise the kid. And there are occasionally major glitches in that system that can cause a lot of damage. That's what happened in this story, and in the next one Jay shows.
And then there's this heartbreaking story.
The 20-year-old father never left her side until he was forced to give her to adoptive parents this week after Kaylee's mother decided to put her up for adoption. In order to keep Kaylee, Colby needed to file paternity action, an affidavit, and a commencement notice with Utah's Vital Records a day before the mother signed the adoption papers relinquishing her rights.
This guy also got his kid back, by the way. I wonder why Cassie Che never brings that up. Anyway, the point is, this non-consensual adoption thing is very rarely an issue. You don't see it happening a lot, and it doesn't mean the adoption process is broken or that it's biased against men. One more example. Toward the beginning of this section, Fred Hayward talks about how his wife duped him into having a baby.
My son's mom wanted to have children with me, and I had always refused, saying, you have this anger problem, you need to get counseling, I'm not going to consider having children with you until that's dealt with, because she would lose her temper almost every day and just use any weapon she could, and like a child's the perfect weapon. So I was really definite about that. But she also used to proofread my articles for me. And I wrote an article for Playboy about Serpico. And when she read that, she told her friend she's going to trick me into fathering the child. She doesn't need my permission. And so that's how my son was conceived.
Now, this is an interesting example because, unlike the last two I talked about, it certainly does speak to a serious social issue. As far as the Center for Disease Control is concerned, what Hayward experienced there was a form of intimate partner violence known as controlling reproductive behavior. It's a surprisingly common thing. According to the CDC, around 8.7% of men report having been with a partner who tried to get pregnant when they didn't want that. And the numbers are around the same for women. Around 8.6% of them report similar things. This phenomenon presents an enormous problem for our justice system. It's hard to prove that contraception was used coercively, and it's difficult to classify what crime that actually is. Other governments are starting to look more closely at the issue, though. Around 2 years ago, in Canada, a case was brought to their Supreme Court about this stuff. A man trying to keep his relationship together poked holes in his condoms and got his girlfriend pregnant. The court ruled that the man had violated consent, and he was sentenced to 18 months in jail, and I think that's a very good thing. I hope America develops a similar infrastructure for dealing with cases like this. It would help both men and women. But even as Fred Hayward's story refers back to a well-documented and poorly dealt with problem, It doesn't feel like that's all the movie wants to show us. Hayward talks to Jay about how his wife got inspired to abuse him through her reading of his men's rights article. And later on, Cassie Jay shows us a really gross, unfortunate clip of the Wendy Williams show.
My friends think I should trick him and stop taking my birth control.
Men have never been in control of our bodies. We're the ones in control. Clap if you think that she should trick him. My people.
Through these scenes, the film expresses two feelings, even though it doesn't say them out loud. First, this is stuff that men and only men face. It is a representation of the ways that men are uniquely oppressed in America when it comes to the reproductive process. Second, women are the problem. They are the ones, the only ones, trapping people in pregnancy. They are the ones taking advantage of a system that has no way to punish them. There is a persistent toxic narrative among women that they are entitled to male bodies and to the children those bodies can help produce. And if we look at the other examples I brought up, we can see how these feelings pervade this section of the film. Jay shows us those adoption articles, right? But of course, those aren't meant to get at some big social issue. There is no big social issue there to get at. Rather, these stories are there to remind the audience that women control children and that they use that power maliciously against men. Or look at Harry Crouch's story again. That story isn't meant to get us thinking about paternity fraud legislation. If he wanted us thinking about that, he would have talked about it in at least some detail. No, his story is simple. It's about a cruel woman who stepped out. It's about the process through which a woman can make a man the worst thing an MRA can imagine. A cuck. So here, the film replaces any kind of systematic critique with a monolithic and careless narrative of male persecution. And the clearest place we can see that is when Jay has a monologue about reproductive issues. This was a turning point in my experience of the film, so we're just gonna watch the whole thing.
I decided to create a flowchart of what I thought father's options might be following a surprise pregnancy. I then put a green line for the paths that I thought would be good turnouts for the father, and I put red lines for the paths that seemed to not be good for the father. Then I created a flowchart for women's options, and did the same with green and red lines. And as I stepped back, I saw all the red lines for the women's options if she does not want the child. But something dawned on me. Of every path the biological father could go down, he's at the mercy of the woman's sole discretion. Although women have very difficult choices to make, she at least has the choice.
Okay, so first off, this is the moment when I started to have pretty big doubts that Jay was ever a feminist, or at least ever a thoughtful feminist. She says women may have tough choices, but at least they have a choice. But, there's a whole lot of women in America who don't have a choice in whether or not they will have a child. Poor women, especially those living in red states, often find it impossible to get an abortion. There are numerous regulations that state governments have put in place to make them harder to access, and there are 5 states that literally only have 1 clinic. This isn't some obscure issue. Female reproductive rights problems are something that most people know about, so for Jay to presuppose every woman's right to choose is frankly disturbing. But what's more, I find this line super interesting because it totally goes against everything the film was arguing for earlier. See, in its first section, the red pill makes one argument very clearly, that just having a choice isn't inherently liberating.
A cab driver who was driving a cab 70 hours a week was not saying, I am earning this money to have power over my wife. He was earning this money even though it took power away from his life.
Yes, men are free to choose more kinds of jobs than women are. They have a greater power to become construction workers and coal miners and soldiers. But within the movie's logic, that's not necessarily a positive thing. Those jobs are physically taxing, after all, and sometimes they're dangerous. But here, in Cassie Jay's monologue, that entire logic, a logic that was so important to the first act, gets thrown out the window. Women get to choose what happens to babies, and so they are the privileged class. There's no consideration of the fact that women being obliged to take care of children might impact them negatively sometimes. The film never discusses how women are more likely to be single parents, how single parents are more likely to be poor, how the burden of being a primary caretaker isn't always fun. It's work. Hard, taxing work. Essentially, then, the red pill wants to have its cake and eat it too. When it comes to men, choices can be bad when they lead to negative outcomes, and so they represent male oppression. When it comes to women, though, choices are an unquestioned good regardless of the outcome, and so they also represent male oppression. Because these bits of logic are mutually contradictory, we're forced to see the film's arguments here as deeply unstable. The movie doesn't care about choice. It doesn't care about presenting choices as complicated things that can be either positive or negative. All it cares about is the conclusion. Men are disadvantaged on every level. Everything else is just a tool to get us to that conclusion, to make us feel like that conclusion has been earned, even if it requires intellectual laziness or a one-sided emotional rhetoric. So, with all this in mind, let's jump forward to the next and last major argument that the film makes. That men face sexual assault and intimate partner violence that people don't care enough about. The movie spends a lot of time and energy discussing this issue. We can see it as the emotional centerpiece of the film, and I think that's for very good reason. Men do face intimate partner violence and sexual assault, and more than that, these issues don't see enough attention. For all intents and purposes, this section should have been a home run, but considering the last 30 minutes of me talking about the film, it should be no surprise that things get a bit more complicated than that. What I'm going to do here is zoom in on this 30-minute passage and see how its arguments proceed from each other. There's probably enough interesting stuff here to justify a whole other video part, but at this point I have to write about something that isn't the red pill in my lifetime, so here we go. The section starts with portraits of roughly 5 men describing their experiences with intimate partner violence and sexual assault. This man was abused when he was a child. This man's wife abused him. This man knows a guy who was abused and who the system failed.
So I called a bunch of domestic violence shelters. I just looked around online and I called, but every place that I called said, we don't help men.
I don't have any problem with these interviews. In fact, I'd say that if the film has any saving grace, it's that it provides survivors a place to talk about their experiences. Here, we have the first claim that the section wants to make. Men are abused, and it's a problem. So far, so good. There's not a lot of people who would disagree with that, and neither would I. After this, Cassie J has a short monologue where she starts to position male abuse as a systemic issue.
In the United States, there are over 2,000 domestic violence shelters. All of them serve female victims, and nearly all of them turn away male victims. 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men will be victims of physical violence by an intimate partner in their lifetime. Sure, there's a slight majority of female victims, but how can that excuse denying men help? Couldn't this be considered gender discrimination?
Her main citation here is that even though men and women face similar problems with intimate partner violence, women benefit from the 2,000 abuse shelters in America, while men have fewer places to go to in these situations. In some ways, I think this argument is pretty reductive. It's very easy to look at the CDC statistics and conclude that male and female intimate partner violence is roughly the same, and so we should handle them in the same way. But ultimately, that assertion fails to get at a few important intricacies. Abuse doesn't express itself in the same way across gender lines. While it's true that things like controlling reproductive behavior and emotional abuse are perpetrated in roughly equal amounts by men and women, patterns of dangerous and life-threatening behavior are more commonly experienced by women. In a 2000 study by the Center of Policy Research, they found that 4.5% of women reported being sexually assaulted by a partner in their lifetime, where the number is 0.2% for men. They found that 20.4% of women were physically assaulted, while the number is 7% for men. And as we approach the most life-threatening forms of abuse, the numbers become more starkly different. Women are astronomically more likely to get beat up or be choked. None of this stuff contradicts the CDC's findings, mind you. Women are not perfect, they're sometimes abusive to men, but the experience of being in danger with someone you're living with, a situation that necessitates having an immediate place to go, is something that's seen by many more women than men. All that said, I can't be too mad at this claim. Like, I'm not opposed to male abuse shelters or to abuse shelters that accept men. While I do think the movie understates the reasons why there are more shelters for women, that doesn't mean we shouldn't develop an infrastructure for men who face these issues. And if the movie had stopped here, there's a good chance that I wouldn't be writing any of this right now. But after the discussion of the asymmetry in abuse shelters, Cassie J, with the help of the other Red Pill participants, comes to the following conclusion.
So why aren't men's rights activists and feminists working together? Michael Kimmel briefly said something that made me wonder. He said it would no longer be a gender problem if both men and women were equally victims of domestic violence. Is that why the number of male victims are never addressed?
The treatment of male abuse has been concealed by feminism. There is a vested interest that gynocentrists have in pretending that men are not abused. To put what Jay says another way, if we started caring about men, feminism could no longer function. The world would take the red pill and feminist ideologies would come crashing down. I think this shift in argument is central to the entire film, so let's unpack it for a little while. The first thing we should notice is that if we look at this intimate partner violence argument as a whole, it kinda looks like each of the claims support each other. First, men are abused. Second, society is very poor at dealing with abused men. Third, feminism seeks to conceal the reality of male abuse. There's an emotional through line here, a sense of narrative closure, like the conclusion we arrived at makes sense and is a necessary extension of where we've been and what we've seen. The fact is, though, those first two claims have literally nothing to do with the conclusion. The idea that feminism, the modern political movement in America, has been doing this really horrible thing to men is the sort of thing that would require a mountain of proof, and that proof is just not there. Where are these male abuse denying feminists at? Like, if feminists refuse to acknowledge that men get abused, you'd think we'd be able to notice since they'd be busy never talking about men getting abused and not caring why they're abused. But that doesn't seem true. I did a brief Google search and found all these articles that were written long before this movie came out. There's an everyday feminism one called 7 Types of Abuse We Don't Take Seriously, which talks a lot about the problem of male abuse. And there's a Cosmopolitan article which gets at the issue too. I'm not saying these publications are the heights of scholarship, but see, that's kind of my point. If there was a conspiracy among feminists to act like male abuse didn't exist, you'd think that these low-tier pop liberal sites would be the worst offenders, but they're not. They don't ignore these things, so who is? I guess this random feminist person in the movie does, but she hardly seems representative of a pattern.
On the whole issue of domestic violence, that's just another word, really. It's a cleanup word about wife beating, because that's really what it is.
Beyond that, the sorts of factors at play when it comes to male intimate partner violence are, very relevant to feminist discourse. See, there's a part of the Red Pill where the Honey Badgers, a group of female anti-feminists, talk about male abuse.
This is not flattering to men, to talk about men's vulnerabilities.
No.
To talk about the ways that they are not strong and that they are, weak. And to be honest about it, it's not flattering.
This is true, what they're saying here. I have no doubt that many men feel shamed into not reporting domestic violence because to do so would be to admit weakness and be seen as effeminate. But this idea isn't transgressive or meaningfully anti-feminist. I'm not an authority on this stuff, but it seems like one of the most important aspects of feminist theory is the notion that gender roles can and should be challenged. And one aspect of that is certainly looking at how the codes of masculinity can be changed, how men should be able to express emotional and physical vulnerability. MRAs might object to some of the words in a feminist's vocabulary, might think using phrases like toxic masculinity to describe this stuff is hurtful, but that seems like a very strange hill to die on to me. Feminists agree that there's a problem, men are abused, and they agree on some of the reasons for that problem. Men and the government both agree that men can't be abused because of various masculine scripts. So how exactly can the film sustain the idea that feminists don't care, that they hide the reality of partner violence to continue peddling their nonsense rhetoric? It just doesn't add up. But what really gets me about this conclusion is how deeply unnecessary it all feels. We have a men's rights issue in front of us here. Men face problems when it comes to intimate partner violence, and those problems aren't adequately dealt with by the state. That could have been the end, right? Instead, we get to see Jay make a strange, unproven claim about what feminism wants. And ultimately, that shift makes the argument a lot less pointed. Part of what makes living in a big society good is that we can deal with problems that aren't common. Yes, women are abused more and in general more seriously, but that doesn't mean we can't do things when stuff happens to men. We can do two things at once, and that's cool. So, because this claim is unmotivated and unsubstantiated, we're forced to think that the only reason it's here is that it represents an idea that is more important to the film than is any specific or systemic male oppression. Feminism is a problem that needs solving. It is a failure movement that seeks female empowerment no matter the cost to men. Now, if you're an MRA who's watching this right now, I think I can maybe guess what you're thinking. This movie isn't about feminism or women or any of those things you said. So many people in the film say, I don't disagree with feminism about everything. Women and their politics don't represent the most important threat to men.
So where do the men's movement and feminism disagree?
Well, only on the fundamental belief that the women's movement says men are the oppressors.
So when I start criticizing feminism, I want you to know you're just part of the problem. They're just part of the problem.
The Red Pill is about men's rights and the ways they suffer. And if you have a problem with talking about that, it's just your anti-male bias speaking. It has nothing to do with what goes on here. And sure, those men do say those things, and Cassie J likes showing those men saying those things. But if that's true, if the movie isn't about feminism or the ways that society privileges women over men, why do all of its three major arguments culminate in that same silly place? This entire movie, is a giant 1-2 punch. First, there's a problem. Second, are women the problem? Maybe it's women, but even if it's not women, let's talk a lot about women. Men are treated badly when it comes to labor, but also, it's better to be a woman than to be a man, and women should stop complaining about not being represented in politics because it's hard to be a politician. Men face paternity fraud issues at the hands of a complicated system, but also, let's make the face of this problem a random woman who cheated on her husband. She's the one who needs fighting against here. Men are abused and people don't care enough. But also, feminism is a modern-day conspiracy that fights to keep men abused and maintain the flawed belief that abuse is a gendered issue. This movie is not called The Problems Men Face 2016 edition. It's called The Red Pill, named after the dividing line between feminist fantasyland and the dark truth of male persecution. And I guess, when you take it, you're supposed to wake up like Neo and see the world for what it is and see the puppet masters for who they are. And, if the wool has been pulled over my eyes, if I am just a blue pillar who wants to stick to my convenient, safe reality, well, at least I'm not this guy.
If men made the rules to benefit men at the expense of women, here's some of the way the world would look like. We would make rules that every woman would be sexual with us whenever we would like. And that the women who are very young, maybe 13 or 14, would be very interested in us.
Okay, I'm just trying to bridge between that soundbite and me never talking about the Red Pill again, because that's what's going to happen, and I'm making that promise to you. Now it's time for my Patreon question of the video. Okie Dokie says, you've inspired me to make my own video essay about Little Shop of Horrors because it's my favorite movie, and I was wondering if you had any tips. Anyway, thank you so much. Thank you, Okie Dokie. That's super sweet. I can't even imagine inspiring somebody to make content. Any advice? Honestly, don't worry about it. Definitely make your video about Little Shop of Horrors. And I feel like I'm saying that and sounding sarcastic, but it's just very late. Please make it. And also, don't like worry if you're not reading it properly. Like, just have fun with it. It's your first video ever. You're gonna come back to it a month later and be like, this is stupid, don't even, it's not good. And then you're gonna make better stuff if you choose to continue. Oh, one last thing. You might notice that my channel has fun, cute art on it that looks good, and the banner now. And that's all thanks to an artist named Ash Barton, who made super cool art and was nothing but a pleasure to work with. So if you want to check out some cool art or commission some rad art, go to their Instagram, which I will link in the description of my video. Okay, that's all. Like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.